In this lesson, we'll take a look at some practical applications of some of the learning and memory research we've been looking at. So let's just recap here the time course of learning. So we've got short-term memory systems like in the hippocampal system. And of course, within the hippocampus, we have molecular consolidation. We have LTP going on there. And then we have that system consolidation process where the hippocampal memories will be, in a sense, transferred into long-term storage areas in the cortex. And then when it is transferred, we would say that the memory is stored in a long-term fashion in the cortex. And again, LTP would have to happen out there as well. So here we're going to introduce some of the research and the theory presented by Robert Bjork. He's at UCLA, and he calls his lab the forgetting lab. And he points out that it is sort of common knowledge that we think of learning as the storage of information, and then forgetting is when that information decays. Now, we've talked about decay, like in the hippocampal system. So there is some biology that kind of bolsters or that backs up this idea that forgetting can be explained by synapses weakening, and we describe some of that. In fact, you'll recall that the hippocampal system here, if we induce LTP in the hippocampal system here, and then the animal learns something within 6 hours, right, that learning can interfere with LTP. It can reduce LTP. Well, in a sense, then, the original learning event is being weakened, and we can think of that as forgetting what was previously learned. The synapses have weakened, and so we're not going to be able to retrieve that as well as if there wasn't that interference. In addition, new neurons, neurogenesis in the hippocampus, can also interfere with the circuitry in the hippocampus, and we might think of that as forgetting what was previously learned as these new neurons take up positions in the circuitry. But Bjork is going to ask us to think about forgetting in a different way. So here's Bjork's contribution to this. He's going to ask us to reconceptualize this idea of forgetting. And so he argues there are two processes involved in sort of learning and retrieving information in the memory systems. One he calls storage strength, and the other he calls retrieval strength. Notice these are psychological concepts, and we'll try to understand them biologically as we go forward. So we can think of a memory as having a high storage strength or a low storage strength, and we can think of information, a memory, as having a high retrieval strength and a low retrieval strength. Now, his argument is that when we learn something and then we don't sort of retrieve it for a while, so we'll call that disuse. So let's say you learned something maybe last year in some class you took, and you learned some information and you'd never really thought about it again. His argument is that the disuse there, so not reactivating the memory, doesn't lead to a decay in the storage strength of the material. So it's not that if it ever was consolidated out in the cortex, it's not that over time the synapses out there in the cortex just get weaker and weaker and weaker, and that's what forgetting is. Rather, he argues that disuse causes a decrease in retrieval strength, right? And we can think of retrieval strength as the ease with which you can access the information, so the current accessibility of the information. So for Bjork, forgetting is a loss of access. So he's focusing on the long-term memory system out in the cortex, not in the hippocampal system per se. So he's understanding forgetting as that as time goes by, and if we don't retrieve memories, we will tend to forget them because we're losing access, right? The retrieval strength is decreasing. The synapses are out there and they're strong if the memory was consolidated, but over time what happens is we lose access to the memory. Now, to get a sense of what he means by storage strength and retrieval strength, let's just kind of take a look at this grid here and use some simple examples. Take your current address and your current phone number. Now, you've probably sort of rehearsed that. You've learned it well, so it's easily accessible, right? So that would be to have high retrieval strength. And you've kind of accessed it so many times, Bjork is going to argue there's high storage strength as well, right? So your knowledge of your address and phone number would be high on the storage strength and high on the retrieval strength. Well, what if you just learn somebody's a new friend, you make a new friend, you learn their phone number? Well, if they just told you, it might be high in retrieval strength, right? You might have been rehearsing it for a time as you put it in your phone, high retrieval strength. But it hasn't had time to consolidate, right? So Bjork would say that it has low storage strength. Even though it's accessible right when you learn it, it hasn't been well consolidated, so low storage strength. Now think about maybe your old phone number or your old address. You might have lived at a different place for a long time or had an old phone number for a long time, so it would have had high storage strength because you would have been using that number a lot. But because you moved, and this was you moved a while ago, you might not have easy access to that old phone number, right? So it would have low retrieval strength, but it had high storage strength. And if somebody reminds you of your old phone number, you might say, "Oh yes, that's it," and then it would be available to you with higher retrieval strength. And then think about this grid here, where there's a low retrieval strength and low storage strength. And this is sort of like a day at school, the stuff you learned today but forgot, right? So the morning class, you learned some stuff, and then by the afternoon, you kind of forgot that stuff. So it didn't really have time to consolidate, and you don't have access to it in the moment, so it would have low retrieval strength as well. Now, here's Bjork's sort of interesting contribution to the discussions of learning and memory. So we'll call this his theory of disuse. So take storage strength. Now, storage strength, remember, is this idea of how well stored, how well consolidated is the information. And he's going to argue that it is storage strength which determines the rate of loss of retrieval strength. And we can think about, why do we forget some things faster than others? Well, we will forget those things that have low storage strength. We're going to forget those things faster, right? They weren't well consolidated. Those things that were well consolidated, we will forget them more slowly. So storage strength determines the rate of loss of retrieval strength. When we learn something well, then we will have a slow process of losing our retrieval access to it. If we don't learn something well, we will lose our retrieval of that information more quickly. Now, here is another key observation by Bjork and a kind of a theoretical claim, and it's counterintuitive. And this is something that students, anybody who wants to try to learn information and do so efficiently, we need to pay close attention to. So here's the counterintuitive relationship. The higher the retrieval strength of some information, the smaller the gains in storage strength with additional practice. And we'll see exactly what that means and how you can apply it in your own study practices. In other words, when information is highly accessible, like you might be just sort of doing some flashcards or rereading some information, it is difficult, he argues, to increase storage strength. Now that's counterintuitive, right? Because you might think that as you go over information again and again and again, you would be increasing storage strength. He argues that when information is highly accessible, when you have high retrieval strength, additional practice does not significantly increase the storage strength. So think about that a second. You can kind of see how that might be sort of counterintuitive. Okay, so now let's try to understand Bjork's two concepts, retrieval strength and storage strength, in terms of some of the biology we've been learning. And we've just been learning about working memory. If we take a look down here at this brain here, we can think of working memory as loops of neural activity. So if I've got, I'm imagining maybe a pizza or something. I've got my eyes closed, I'm imagining that, and the idea is that there are neural circuits in the frontal lobes and neural circuits in the visual system here, and there is reverberating loops of activity, so action potentials racing from the visual representation of a pizza up to the frontal cortex cells, and then they send signals back to the visual cortex, and so there's this reverberating loop of activity, and so long as that action potentials are racing around these loops of neurons, we are having the image of a pizza in our mind. Now, I could be imagining it, or I could just be looking at the pizza and just continually processing and be conscious of looking at it. But the idea is that the contents of our mind, what we're currently thinking about or perceiving or imagining, we can think of that content as biologically based in loops of neural activity, right? Now, whenever you'll remember just from studying LTP, whenever cells take part in activating the target cell, right, the synapses can be strengthened, right? So if we think about a loop of neural activity, well, all of the synapses in that loop then are going to be temporarily strengthened, right? You'll get LTP-like strengthening in those loops. Now remember, LTP has two phases, an early phase and then the late phase. The late phase is the more kind of durable. It requires protein synthesis. It's the long-term changes in the synapse. But there is an early phase of LTP. So if we just kind of engage in a loop of neural activity, there will be temporary increases in the synapse here, in the strength of the synapses. And so for Bjork, we can think of this as being related to this idea of retrieval strength. When we were just studying our flashcards, right, and looking at our cards and going over them, well, we had that information in our working memory. And if we just put it away for a moment and then come back to it, well, those synapses are still temporarily sort of strengthened. So we'll be able to retrieve that information relatively easily. So one way to understand Bjork's idea of retrieval strength here is that if we've just been studying some information, the early phase of LTP is going to help us access that information on a short time scale. Right? Even if we put our cards away for a little bit and we come back to it and we can access it, we would say we have high retrieval strength due to the temporary increase in synaptic strength in the loops of neural activity involved in processing the information. Now let's try to understand why it is that retrieval strength, when it's high, further studying might not be helpful to increase storage strength. So let's use our hippocampal system here. So let's say you're about to study, so you haven't picked up your flashcards or picked up your history book or whatever, and we've got some synapses in the hippocampus. Now you're studying some new material, doing your flashcards, reading your text, etc. Okay, some LTP is happening in the hippocampus, right? Now, the thing is, if you just put the book away or your flashcards down for a little bit of time, and then you pick them up again, retrieval strength, from Bjork's point of view, is going to be high because the temporary LTP, the early phase LTP, will still be there, and so those synapses will still be strong. But the idea is when you restudy and the synapses are already strong, it may be difficult to make them even stronger. So studying more when retrieval strength is already high is not effective for increasing storage strength. Right? The reason you have high retrieval strength is the early phase LTP here. Those synapses have been strengthened, and so you can reaccess the information well. But that's not going to help out the long-term process of consolidating the information in the long-term memory system. Right? Recall that the long-term memory system, we need to system consolidate. We need to get the hippocampal memories out to the cortex. Right? And so from Bjork's point of view, we can think of storage strength is related to the synaptic changes, the long-term synaptic changes, like the late phase LTP that's happening in the hippocampus, and then the LTP that's happening in the cortex that stores our memories for the long term. Okay, so here's one of the take-home messages for Bjork, and it's a misconception about learning that many students may have here. And the misconception is that retrieval strength equals storage strength. And for Bjork, that's going to be false, right? So what we seem to do as learners sometimes is we take the fluency of retrieval, the ease with which we can retrieve stuff during a study session, and we think that that is an indication of our long-term storage of that information. But it is not necessarily a good measure of the long-term storage of the information. And again, the idea is when we restudy, we might not really be able to increase the strength of the synapses there. So studying when you've already done some LTP here, if you keep on studying, you may not be helping your long-term storage out in the long run. And but what if you're a student and you think, okay, yes, I know my flashcards well, and I've been studying, and I got them now. And then if you conclude from that just because you've been restudying and you've got high retrieval strength, if you conclude from that that you will have high storage strength, that's a misconception, says Bjork. Okay, so let's put it all together here. in these two graphs here. Here we have up the top here retrieval strength here, and then time here, and then we have storage strength down here. Of course, the goal, if you're going to be a lifelong learner, is to increase the storage strength of the information that you want to learn. And many students, if you have a strategy of cramming and so on, then the idea is you're going for retrieval strength from Bjork's point of view rather than storage strength. So here's the idea. Let's say you're doing some studying here. Okay, so as you study some information, your retrieval strength will increase, right? So you're doing short-term LTP, the early phase of LTP, and you're priming those synapses involved in the loops of working memory, and so you've got high retrieval strength. Now remember the counterintuitive situation for Bjork. When you have high retrieval strength, additional practice does not yield large gains in storage strength. We can think of that as because you've kind of maxed out your LTP in the hippocampus, and so studying more ain't going to help, right? So when you have high retrieval strength, additional practice doesn't increase the ultimate storage strength after the whole consolidation process. Now, in addition, so one of the problems here is that students may often take that as a measure of storage strength. So we study and we say to ourselves, oh, we have high retrieval strength, so therefore I'm going to stop studying, right? And then furthermore, students often underestimate the amount of forgetting that happens as just time goes by, right? Remember, from Bjork's point of view, forgetting is a loss of access, a loss of retrieval strength. And because there was not much of a storage strength gain here, the slope of the loss of the retrieval strength will be steep, right? Because we didn't make a big gain in the storage strength from here to up here, the forgetting is going to be steep, and students tend to underestimate the amount of forgetting. Now, as it happens, though, there is something that can help us increase our storage strength. You see it down here, and that something is sleep. So researchers are collecting a lot of data now that suggests that sleep enhances consolidation. And the consolidation we're talking about here would be system consolidation, right, from hippocampus out to the cortex, and of course out in the cortex, LTP, molecular consolidation. And so if we just go to sleep after a study session, sleep will increase our storage strength because it helps consolidation, right? But the bigger take-home message for Bjork is to realize that certain study strategies can increase storage strength in addition to just sleep, although sleep is very important, right? And one of the things he argues is that what you want to do to increase storage strength is to make retrieval difficult. So when you have high retrieval strength, then stop studying and purposely then create a delay, create a time delay. And because that time delay will necessarily lead to a reduction in retrieval strength, right? And then the idea is after some time delay, you want to test yourself, right? So quiz yourself or test yourself. Try to retrieve the information, right? And he calls this a desirable difficulty. The time delay is a desirable difficulty in terms of learning. The forgetting that happens over time is a friend of learning, right? The best way to increase storage strength is to create difficult retrieval conditions. One way to make retrieval difficult is a time delay between study sessions. So the idea is when you are studying and you have high retrieval strength, don't keep studying, but create a delay. Come back to it. And that kind of study is going to yield greater gains in storage strength. And again, once you have higher storage strength, right, the rate of loss of retrieval strength is slower. So this slope here is more gradual than the forgetting that was happening here, than the loss of retrieval strength here. So one of the take-home messages here for Bjork is that students do have misconceptions about learning and memory, and it affects our study, right? So first of all, if we cram, right, then we're kind of just hoping that our high retrieval strength will get us through the test. But if we want storage strength, right, if we want to improve the storage of the information, and so therefore slow down the forgetting of the information, then we have to do certain things. And one of the things is to create desirable difficulties in our study strategies. Time delays is one of them, and testing is another. Instead of rereading information, he argues, forcing yourself to retrieve information is the best way to increase storage strength. We'll look at some of the reasons why in the next lesson.